Hello and welcome. Last night I recorded a video addressing reactive abuse. It was an off-the-cuff exploration of the subject, not from an academic, but rather from a personal perspective. And as I mentioned in this last video, it has been some time since I've given the topic much thought, and even longer since I last looked into what others have said and written about it. Today, I discovered that over the past 3 or 4 years, quite a few more videos, blogs, and articles have appeared on the matter of reactive abuse. I also searched to see who coined the term, since I find that understanding the origins of these concepts helps to contextualize and illuminate the finer points of the model. Apparently, psychologist Lenore Walker is credited with the emergence of this term. While Dr. Walker's model for the cycles of abuse has been criticized for being overly simple and poorly supported, it is a good foundation for understanding the cyclical nature of conflict and violence in abusive relationships. I could find little information about the origins of the term reactive abuse, but discovered this passage compiled by Chrome from various sources. Reactive abuse refers to a victim's defensive response to narcissistic abuse behaviors. It occurs when someone who has been abused begins to defend themselves by responding to abuse with physical and/or verbal attacks. The term was coined online on one of the chat forums. Psychologist Lenore Walker defined the cycle of abuse in her book titled The Battered Woman. Unlike mutual abuse, reactive abuse only occurs after the victim is pushed to a breaking point. Here ends the summary. After reviewing a great deal of material on the subject, I decided to write this out to help me better compose and present my thoughts on this complex subject. In this video, I would like to further explore what reactive abuse is and how it can affect us. I know I usually do this free form, and so this is a little bit of a departure as I attempt to work from a more scripted format, but I do think that this is complex and nuanced and does deserve a little more focused attention if I'm going to discuss it any further. And I'd like to be able to discuss it further because I feel that what I said was helpful unto itself, especially from a non-academic personal perspective, just exploring the broad strokes. But it occurs to me today as I look into it further that there is more to be understood. And so I'm going to take this opportunity to try and flesh out what I began last night, whenever. To begin with, I'd like to review some of the articles that I have come across today that do a really good job of explaining what it is a little more effectively. So, starting with Very Well Mind, looking at an article entitled Understanding Reactive Abuse, Signs and Solutions by Sanjana Gupta. Okay, this is from August 10th, 2023. It's reasonably current. And beyond the table of contents, we begin with someone who is being abused might eventually reach their breaking point and lash out at their abuser in return. This is known as reactive abuse. Reactive abuse occurs when someone who has been abused begins to defend themselves by responding to abuse with physical and/or verbal attacks. Eyesight. According to Alexa Connors, LMSW, a senior therapist at the dorm which offers intensive trauma therapy for young adults. In this article, we explore the psychological dynamics of reactive abuse, the signs to look out for, the impact it can cause, and steps to get help. See, we need to get help with these things. We can't be alone with this. It's literally crazy making stuff, and we need somebody to spot us when we're going through this. So let's start with the dynamics of reactive abuse. If someone is being physically or verbally abused, their fight or flight response might kick in to help them protect themselves. If they are unable to flee, they might fight back against their abuser by attacking them physically or verbally. They may resort to yelling, screaming, insulting, or even assaulting their abuser. Self-defense is a more accurate term. It's important to understand that someone who has to resort to reactive abuse is not the instigator. Rather, they are the victim who is reacting to being abused. Unfortunately, reactive abuse often works against the victim of abuse because their abuser may use it as leverage against them. Once the victim of abuse responds this way, the perpetrator often claims that the abuse is mutual, says Connors. In some cases, the abuser might even claim to be the wounded party and try to use these instances as proof that they have been abused instead of the other way around. Perpetrators may use these manipulation tactics as a way to justify their abuse, control their victims, and keep them from leaving or speaking about the abuse, Connors explains. They may even try to record the person's reaction or provoke a response in public so that they have witnesses who can say that they saw them being abused. Recognizing the signs of reactive abuse. These are some of the signs and characteristics of reactive abuse. Uncharacteristic behavior. The person's behavior is not characteristic of their nature. They have never shown abusive tendencies toward any other person or situation. Provocation. The abuser uses antagonistic behavior like public or private humiliation, threats, name-calling, insulting, or gaslighting in order to get the person to their breaking point and elicit a violent response, says Connors. Self-defense. Pardon. The person's reaction is an act of self-defense to protect themselves against an abuser. They never initiate the abuse. They only respond this way when provoked, once they have reached their limit and cannot take it anymore. Confusion. The person feels confused about their actions. They feel like they don't know who they are anymore and how they could react like that. Guilt. A person feels guilty and ashamed of their behavior afterward. Doubt. Because victims of reactive abuse are made to doubt their own reality, see gaslighting, it may be difficult to identify when they are in this abusive dynamic, says Connors. Fear. The perpetrator uses the victim's actions as evidence against them, says Connors. They use fear to control and manipulate them into doing what they want. The psychological impact of reactive abuse. Research shows that experiencing abuse can be traumatic and lead to physical and psychological damage. In a situation where the victim responds with reactive abuse, the abuser may convince them that they too are engaging in abusive behavior, which may result in feelings of guilt and shame, Connor explains. This dynamic can be extremely damaging and harmful to the person's mental health, as it may cause them to experience increased anxiety, depression, isolation, sleep-related issues, confusion, and mood swings. The connection between reactive abuse and gaslighting. Victims of this dynamic may also experience gaslighting in the following ways. Flipping the narrative. The perpetrator may flip the narrative and convince the person who is being harmed that they are causing harm. Lying. The perpetrator might outright lie about something that has occurred, such as the fact that they had initiated the abuse. Creating doubt. The perpetrator may call the victim crazy or insane and cause them to doubt their own reality. Minimizing concerns. The perpetrator may dismiss or minimize the victim's concerns or issues. Gaslighting is a form of emotional abuse that can cause victims to blame themselves. Victims may feel as if they are crazy and demonstrate an increased dependence on their partner. Again, this is a quote from Alexa Connors. I want to take a moment aside from the article and just address gaslighting. It's a very specific and intentional behavior meant to erode a person's sense of reality and their confidence in their own perceptions and feelings. And it's not just, the way we throw it around colloquially, like, oh, they're just gaslighting me about this thing. It's a whole, long, ugly process, and it does actually erode a person's sense of self and sanity and ability to navigate the world. And It is through ongoing repetitious behaviors that call into doubt little things until the evidence stacks up that, yeah, maybe I am losing my mind. I believe it comes from an old play. I think it was from the 1940s, where the husband was adjusting the lights, the old gas lights, so they'd be higher or lower, and then denying that the light had changed to drive his wife crazy, saying, "Dear, you're imagining things. Nobody touched the lights. Relax." And this alone was enough to make her crazy. Now imagine your reality is being denied and you're constantly being told you're delusional, you're paranoid, it's because you're crazy that we're having these problems. And it's really emphasizing the fact that you should doubt yourself. And being healthy, well-adjusted, pro-social humans, we will eventually succumb to that doubt and feel very confused and disempowered by it. So let's in this case understand gaslighting isn't just messing with somebody here and there. It's an ongoing and destructive pattern. All right, let's get back to it. Yay, more of the fun stuff. How to break the cycle of reactive abuse. This is actually the good part. If you are a victim of abuse, there are some steps that can help you break the cycle of reactive abuse. Identify the pattern. The first step is to develop awareness and recognize the fact that the abuser is provoking you in the hopes of getting a reaction. Recognize provocation. Start paying attention to the abuser's manipulation tactics and antagonistic behaviors, says Connors. Notice which behaviors are activating and triggering. Another aside, this is the part about self-knowledge. We have to know our own stuff. We have to know our own dark, shadowy aspects that we deny and disavow and suppress. We need to know where our wounds are as we navigate these kinds of minefields, that we don't take a wrong step and activate something that is better left dormant. It's knowing how to identify when we are provoked, to have the presence of mind to say, my body feels different. My focus, my visual field is becoming broader or more narrow according to what's happening. My heart rate, these physiological cues are there. We also can notice that our breath is changing and our thoughts may be going faster, or our responses might be slower, and we're not aligned with what's happening. This is part of being able to identify that we are feeling provoked, whether somebody intends to do it or not. This is just how this goes down, and how we can intercede to identify it early on and pull back on the reins before it runs us off the edge of the cliff. So recognize provocation. Yeah, just start paying attention to the abuser's manipulation tactics and antagonistic behaviors. Notice which behaviors are activating and triggering. That's going to give us an insight and a sort of a map to what goes on inside of us. Where are our vulnerabilities, and how do we shelter those or become more resilient in bearing those parts of us? Can we do it with people who are unsafe? Probably not. And what do we do to make sure that we are with safe people when we do expose these vulnerabilities? It's a helpful insight. We can learn through these rather unpleasant experiences a lot more about our own composition and response patterns. All right, be mindful of your reaction. This can be difficult to do in the moment, but be mindful of your reaction to the abuse. The abuser is trying to provoke you until you snap. So try to react mindfully or avoid reacting at all. This requires that you be a pretty self-aware, present, and well-regulated person, because it's designed to whittle away at every little weakness in the system and collapse the walls. This takes a certain level of conditioning. So whatever state you're in, it's good to evaluate how you can come from the place you are to the strongest, most prepared place when it's time to respond rather than being provoked into reaction. This is where our power lies. We think about the problems, we talk about the problems, we fantasize about how to escape. But going in and learning how to master ourselves moment to moment is really the thing that gives us power and access to the kind of freedom we deserve and dream of. So, yeah, develop coping skills. I don't like the phrase coping skills. I kind of like the idea that we just have some good life skills that allow us to bear the pain and move forward effectively. But let's go with coping skills. This can help you manage the intensity of your own emotions and reactions. You can empower yourself against reactive abuse by learning skills and tools to manage your stress and emotions. Yes, and these require practice over time. It's a reconditioning, and it doesn't happen overnight. So let's give ourselves grace and be patient with the process and engage with the process, understanding that it's an ongoing experience and not us charging from one point to another, or like reaching a destination. This is an ongoing growth and development kind of thing. So we definitely need to develop the skills and the tools. So valid point. Reach out for help. Reach out to trusted friends or family members or mental health services. A therapist or a loved one can help you process harmful relationship dynamics. And this is important too, because not only do we need help processing what's happened within one relationship, we need another relationship within which to heal through the healthy interactions we have. It's not enough to just leave what's unhealthy behind. A more complete state of healing can come from being in a relationship in a way that we can do so much good work on our own, and well should, but it's really in the relationship with others that we can reestablish a sense of place and safety and clarity, and we really need this. So it's more than just reaching out for help. It's engaging in relationships that will allow us to learn and grow and heal in so many ways. So leave the relationship. Yes, Connors recommends reaching out to domestic violence hotlines to get help and safely leave an abusive situation. This is rarely as easy as it sounds. For people who don't have experience with this, it's altogether too easy to say, oh, why don't you just get out and go to a shelter? People who have been in those situations and understand how the systems work can tell you it's not that simple. Even if the best system was available to come pick you up in the middle of the night and set you up for success for the rest of your life tomorrow, it's still not that simple. There's so many factors. So yes, we want to move away from our unhealthy relationships, and healing ourselves and building our place in the world out a little further as we go is a great way to provide for that possibility. But we have to understand that there are many factors in play, and it may take time, and we can't expect other people to understand as we struggle through that process. But I can take a moment to say that if you're among the people who don't understand this, a little more compassion and curiosity might be the way to approach a person who is trying to extricate themselves from an abusive relationship. Okay. So this is one piece. It goes on to talk about empowering yourself against reactive abuse. This is important. This is the healing part. Reactive abuse can leave you feeling guilty, ashamed, confused, scared, and angry. You may feel trapped and not know what to do. It can be helpful to protect yourself by paying attention to the abuser's actions, resisting provocation, and reacting mindfully. Again, that's going to take work, but it is the way. It is the best investment possible. You could spend so much time being emotional and ruminating and fighting, but going inward and doing this work is what really does equip us to gain that elevation and that traction that would allow us to move on and actually do this healing. So, leaving an abusive situation is not easy. As soon as you are safely able to do so, create an exit plan and leave the abusive situation. You can reach out to trusted loved ones or domestic violence hotline for help and support. You may not always have people to turn to, and a hotline is not always going to help you, but do find your people. Do find some network of human love and support that's going to help, because it's it's not enough to simply stop being wounded. It takes more to actually heal. All right, so that's one article. Okay, moving on to another resource. Looking at Medium, featuring Psychologues magazine, which was entitled Reactive Abuse and published on January 10th, 2025. So very current. Let's move along. There's a lot of discussion here about much of what we've already covered, but down below, I find it interesting that they cover the psychological impact of reactive abuse, saying, in such situations, the victims are caught in an abusive dynamic. The reactive abuse often leaves them with feelings of guilt, shame, and anxiety. Moreover, they feel extremely powerless and helpless after the incident. The victims might feel that they are just as guilty of abuse as their abuser for reacting this way. They may begin to doubt reality of their sense of self as a result of the abuser's gaslighting. The victim might face lifelong traumatic memories as a result of abuse and reactive abuse. And this is a lesser discussed subject, but some of our trauma comes from what we do as much as what others do to us. It's not uncommon for a person to be traumatized by committing a violent act. There are people for whom remorse is not a problem, but for those of us who do feel some sense of compunction, this can actually really cause its own separate trauma to whatever else was going on. So it's important to recognize the ways in which we can traumatize ourselves through having these responses. So that's a key point there. Finally, they might hesitate to reach out for help, as they might feel that people will judge them for staying in an abusive relationship for a long time, for reacting poorly, and for being unable to effectively manage the situation. This is not an unfounded fear. This is a reality that people in this situation may well face. It is very hard for people outside of this to identify and understand what's really going on, and there is a great deal of blame and shame that the victim will face in trying to relate what's happened. And as the details come to light, they're going to feel that they're losing ground and are on the defense in a whole new way, while they're already on their heels from everything they're experiencing from inside the abusive relationship. And this is incredibly overwhelming and disempowering. And when we're already going through traumatic experiences, our ability to stay present and agentic is impaired by that to begin with. And so again, we wonder, why do people go back to abusive partners? Why don't they just leave? It really is not that simple. And I think that this is an important subject to bring into a larger discussion about these matters, whether it's just online or in family courts or in clinical settings, to really understand that this is what is often at play when you see a partner who is just unable to escape their circumstances. So that really stood out to me. Also, in the conclusion of this article from Medium, it reads, people usually say, why didn't you just get out of the relationship, to a victim of abuse very often. But it is easier said than done. Abuse is a complex dynamic, and breaking the cycle is even more complex. Reactive abuse is a very misunderstood term and is a form of survival instinct rather than a deliberate intent to harm. The victim should not feel guilty for their responses and should be helped to break free from this pattern. This is true. We don't need to guilt and shame people. I don't know if I agree. It's healthy to feel some guilt and shame for acting out of character, for doing our share of harm in this. I think it's more empowering to say, yeah, I did do that, but that action only exists within the context of what happened here and is not indicative of who I am and how I operate on the whole. So there's a useful distinction to be made there. And I think what I really want to underscore here is that it is a survival instinct rather than a deliberate intent to harm. And this is one of the key distinctions between being able to say you have two people abusing each other, or you're looking at a case of reactive abuse. So that's one to underline. Here I have another resource from the MEND project. I don't see a date or an author on this, but it's entitled Understanding Reactive Abuse, What You Need to Know. Discerning the experiences and stories of two people can be tricky and confusing. This is especially true when there is a long history of abuse, and the victim's involuntary trauma responses are triggered by recurring abusive attacks. Both people act in ways that could be considered emotionally violent and/or abusive to an outsider. This may make it appear as if there are two victims and two abusers when, in reality, there is only one. A violent or aggressive response to an abusive partner is called reactive abuse. We prefer the term reactive defense. The victim's reaction does not turn them into an abuser. So what's going on? In this article, you will learn how to define reactive abuse, what causes the abused person to react emotionally or physically violently, the difference between the abuser's motive and mindset versus their victims, and how to discern who's the abuser. Okay, skipping ahead a little. Reactive abuse occurs when the victim either becomes exhausted and frustrated or the aggressor in response to the abuser, such as by throwing something, pushing the abuser out of the way, slapping, raging, or angry outbursts. In truth, reactive abuse is self-defense, not abuse. This happens when the victim who has been dealing with the abusive behavior over a sustained period of time reaches an internal breaking point. The prolonged physical or emotional abuse they have endured causes them to react impulsively rather than respond calmly. A victim who reacts abusively is usually acting out of character, leaving them confused and surprised by their response. This leads to more self-doubt and self-criticism. Even though it comes out of the body's natural defense mechanism, which is designed to protect them from violence, reactive abuse almost always harms the victim more than the abuser. Even in healthy relationships, there are times we respond in ways that are uncharacteristic of our true selves. So why isn't reactive abuse considered abuse? Let's take a look. How does reactive abuse work? Reactive abuse is a victim's way of self-defense against the overwhelming injustice their abuser is doing to them. Their defensive reaction does not put the victim on equal par with the abuser or transform them from victim to abuser. You might wonder, why doesn't it? To answer this, let's look into the mindset of an abuser. The abusive mindset. Victims of domestic violence do not bring violence upon themselves, nor are they abusive like their partner is. True abuse is a choice the abuser makes. It is not an accident, and it's never the victim's fault. Abusers, or those who cause harm, have entrenched faulty thinking patterns and beliefs that lead to destructive behaviors and a need to power over and control their partner. Abusers have entrenched beliefs about entitlement, placing the victim in a downgraded position. These feelings encourage them to use manipulative aggression. And when the victim raises a reasonable complaint or concern or hurt, the abuser will react defensively to shut the victim's voice down. It can also be covert, though: gaslighting, minimization, blame shifting, or any other hidden manipulative behavior. Whether overt or covert, abusive words and actions are forms of intimate partner violence. I want to just take a minute and say that we probably need to explore what domestic violence is, or intimate partner violence. It has so many names, but it all bleeds from the same heart. It's really something that I may end up following on with this a bit more. Meanwhile, the reverse, however, is not automatically true, because violence does not necessarily equal abuse. When victims fight back, it is usually to stop a dangerous situation or oppression. The actions do not come from an abusive mindset to power over and control their partner. Reactive abuse is often due to prolonged states of high stress and confusion, or what are known as trauma states, in response to having their voice, and personhood controlled or shut down. It doesn't equal mutual abuse. Understanding this requires us to take a look at what causes the victim to respond this way. Continuing with the article from the MEND Project, the involuntary reaction. The victim's response is an involuntary reaction caused by the cumulative trauma they have been experiencing over time and comes from a place of extreme frustration or self-defense. Whether the abuse is physical, emotional, or sexual, it causes deep fear and stress and puts the victim on high alert. When the victim senses danger, the brain releases stress hormones that help the body defend against the threat. This is known as a stress response or a trauma response, which is more commonly called a flight, freeze, flight, or fawn response. Anybody not familiar with the 4 Fs, which have now been expanded to include other things? This is an automatic response we have to perceived danger. Whether it's real or perceived, this is what our body's going to do to get us up out of there in one piece. In other words, the victim's natural response is for their body to prepare to freeze, flee, fight back, or appease their abuser, especially when they perceive a threat to their safety or freedom. Recurring trauma has harmful effects on one's mind and body. Some of this can actually be visualized through imaging. I believe it's a loss of volume in the hippocampus will show up after a long period of being exposed to this kind of distress. So it's not just in your mind, it's actually in your head. It's physically there that we can see the basically brain damage that's done by this. So when we're looking at people and they seem distraught and they seem dysregulated and a little off center, there's a reason they've suffered. Whether or not they've suffered direct physical trauma, there is a physical impact. So it's worth considering that this is more than a person just getting themselves into a tizzy and acting badly. All right, let's see. It says you're not broken, you've been hurt. Yeah. Let's see. Examples of reactive abuse. When the victim feels overwhelmed with distress, fear, and powerlessness, their natural defense may be to scream, yell insults, or even physically lash out at their abuser to either clarify the false narrative being imposed upon them or cut off the abuser's attack. All right, there are a couple of things in there. One, if you're fighting back, that's a good sign, because another outcome is learned helplessness, where we just stop fighting for ourselves. We go into full self-abandonment, and it's a much bleaker state. So as bad as it is that we're out here hollering and carrying on, take it as a good sign that you've still got fight in you, and you're still somehow anchored to what is right and true, even if you have trouble believing in it, if you've fallen into doubt because of this. So that's one piece. And I want to also underscore false narrative being imposed, because that's a major part of how this works. It's going to be some loosely related to a truth somewhere kind of story that really does not represent what's going on at all. So that's a piece of this as well. A person who does not normally curse, hit, or rage may find themselves doing these things in response to their partner's abusive and controlling aggression. So it's important to note that this is out of character. In most cases, with most people, under most circumstances, this is not your go-to move. This is not your nature. This is not your default. It's really about being able to distinguish whether or not we are, in fact, being abusers and actively trying to control and manipulate and domineer over others, and when we're actually having a reaction to that being perpetrated against us. Here, the MEND Project offers an example of an adult's reaction. Perhaps a woman reacts to years of her husband's abuse by hitting him with a skillet. Not okay, ladies, but let's use this example. Or she screams at him, calls him names, or slaps him. Also not good, but how did we get here? When the police respond to the domestic violence call, her abuser most often presents in a calm and controlled manner while manipulatively telling them she assaulted him. She will readily admit she hit him, apologize, and try to explain. This is really at the crux of it, because Those who are not abusive are prepared to admit their fault and to apologize and to work toward understanding and resolution. Those who are not willing to do that may be working with a more abusive mindset. Onward. Internally, she doesn't know how to explain because she doesn't understand why her mind and body reacted that way. Recurring trauma often causes cognitive thinking to be impaired, making the involuntary trauma responses more confusing to the victim and more wrongly judged by outsiders. So that's back to the physiology. This touches on what I said about legal concerns in the last video. The police may see her as the abuser or one of two abusers. Rather than getting the help she needs, she will be blamed for reacting, even though it may have taken place after months or years of physical, psychological, or sexual abuse. While being interviewed by police, she is not able yet to manage her trauma responses, thus appearing emotionally unstable, weak, or lacking credibility. This is part of how a victim will seek help and not be able to obtain it. While at the same time, the actual abuser is calculated, remains calm, and controls the narrative. So the person who's actually initiated this out of an intention to control or injure another feels no remorse, no fear. They're calm, they're composed. In fact, the fact that their target is acting up is maybe very satisfying to them. It's that I've entered the code and now I get you to do the thing I wanted you to do to make my point for me. It could be somebody used the example of shaking a can of soda being like gaslighting, abuse, neglect, and then popping it. And when it overflows, it's like, oh no, how did it explode like that? Right? This is what goes on. So you're the can of soda overflowing, and the person who shook you is standing there, cool as a cucumber, no worries in the world, being like, I don't know, she's just going off. What can you do about it? Can be the other way around. I'm not, when I'm using pronouns, it's just generic because women will do this to men too. So let's bear that in mind as I carry on, that this is not me indicating that men do this to women and women don't do this to. This goes both ways. This is family, friends, lovers, partners. It's men, it's women. It's about running an unconscious psychological program that knows how to identify and exploit another person's pain points to its advantage. It's not even a person thinking the way a normal person thinks. It's this unconscious program mindlessly, almost addictively seeking the reaction that makes it feel powerful and alive. So yeah, this is why you'll see a person can be very calm and composed after destroying another person's whole experience of life and be like, must be them. Look at them. They're distraught. They're the ones who are crazy, not me. What do you need to know, officer? Yeah, so this is one of the ways that people can get trapped in this. Even in self-defense, reactive abuse behaviors can be violent and are frequently misinterpreted. This is the sad truth. It can be difficult, even for skilled responders, addressed below in the confusion for responders section. Okay, they get into that. That's good, because this is part of why the gap between the need for help and the receipt of help is still so wide. Sometimes the reactions are so violent, we are left wondering if reactive abuse is justified or if it should be on an equal par with the original abuse. If you wonder if reactive abuse is justified, keep reading. All right? Is reactive abuse justified? As you can see, reactive abuse is the body's way of protecting itself instinctively from a traumatic encounter or threat. The person being harmed has little to no control over the response as it happens. The reaction is justified and sometimes necessary to stop the abuse. Here's why. The brain responds to threats by commanding a flight, fight, freeze, or fawn response. The brain chemistry that causes them to flee isn't significantly different than when their mind and body react by fighting back, because fleeing isn't an aggressive act toward the abuser Whether it's justified isn't a question we ask. However, when a victim fights back in self-defense, the questions and problems for the victim begin. So the issue is that people who have a fight response are much more susceptible to being entrapped and manipulated this way. And this is why it does come back again to us figuring out what activates that, how we express it, and how we can get a grip on the reins that it doesn't take us places we don't want to go. So this is true. Skimming over. With either fleeing or fighting, the brain directs the action. The traumatized individual often is unable to ignore the brain's directive. The response is involuntary. It's automatic. And we're going to say, okay, but it's your brain. What happened? Right. But if somebody commands you to touch a hot stove, what happens? There are more powerful forces at play than our intellect and our ego. So it is important to make this subtle distinction and appreciate that this isn't a conscious choice someone's making, and that they do feel powerless and they are injured by it and they do feel remorse. So that is a pretty key set of distinctions between a person who is provoked to this level and a person who chooses to initiate this pattern. So, all right, the response isn't voluntary, it's automatic. Thus, determining whether reactive abuse is justified isn't an appropriate question. If it is reactive abuse, it's done in response to abuse and is justified. I'm not sure I fully agree with that, but I think that it's closer to the truth than a countervailing claim would be. The traumatized victim is defending themselves from a continuous stream of abusive behaviors that have happened over time. Now, legally, it may not be taken into consideration because if you're saying it's self-defense, it needs to be, well, this person was actively attacking me, and having a psychological reaction to an accumulated preponderance of abuses is different from reacting to direct action in the moment. So ethically, we can make the case that this is a different matter from choosing to be hurtful to another person. But we also need to be mindful that in practical and legal terms, that may not bear as much influence as we'd like. So another point to keep in mind. One cannot compare the victim's involuntary reactions to abuse that aims to power over and control another person. The motives are diametrically opposed, and that's where I think when we're working in the emotional places trying to heal this, when we're exploring this philosophically with an ethical perspective, I think that's really valuable. But it is important to remember that we're working in different domains as we talk about this, so mind the domain. Yeah, they're talking about the danger of reactive abuse and how it usually does not protect the victim as much as it helps the abuser. So in working to resolve these issues, remember that you don't want to give aid to the enemy. Be like, I'm just helping them if I allow them to elicit this response from me to get the reaction they're seeking. So there we go. Should we read the advantage of the abuser? I guess I haven't finished this article. I was skimming a whole bunch of them. All right, let's go through. We're here for the long haul, right? We're going to do a long format one? Let's do it. The advantage of the abuser. Abusers rely on the victim to react rather than calmly respond. In actuality, the abuser baits the victim to get a reaction so they can shift the blame onto the victim. Abusers are often, relentless in their efforts to push the victim to the breaking point, hoping they will react uncontrollably so the abuser can mislabel them as mentally ill, crazy, or abusive. Abusers rely on the victim's reactive outbursts to protect the abuser's image and shift blame and responsibility for the conflict onto the victim. Those with narcissistic tendencies thrive when they garner sympathy from friends and family members, including those closest to the victim. Narcissists are highly focused on their public image and are most potent when they garner positive attention. I avoid talking about narcissistic personality disorder and people who are high in trait narcissism, but in this case, it's hard to do because it is usually a result of a personality disorder that you'll see this behavior. So we'll give it a nod. Meanwhile, pardon me. Meanwhile, the victim loses whatever safe community they had and moves closer toward complete isolation. Public shaming effectively labels the victim as the problem, and that's where a victim loses all ground, or a person who's being victimized. Let's be careful about identifying as victims. We can acknowledge that we have been victimized and have acted in the role of the victim without adopting the whole identity and diminishing all that we are down to this state. So I'm going to put one of my finer points on it. Over time, once friends and family question the victim's mental well-being, they side with the abuser. So not only does the target lose their support network, but the perpetrator is able to co-opt them and use them as allies in their campaign against the target. This is sadly quite common. Pardon me. This makes it nearly impossible for the victim to feel safe, to ask friends or family for the help they desperately need and deserve. Suppose the victim decides to leave the relationship. In that case, the abuser has already used deceptive influence regarding the victim's behavior to continue their false narrative and control, ultimately scapegoating the victim. In child custody court battles, for example, the abuser may highlight the reactive abuse to make the judge question the victim's credibility and stability as a parent, or blame the victim for being the abusive one. Yeah, this is why I feel that we could benefit from greater understanding of this subject and these dynamics, especially as it impacts families and children. So this is part of why I feel it is worth going into what some of the challenges are. Or to defend against the victim's valid claims of domestic violence, possibly denying requests for protective orders. So yeah, you can lose a lot of ground if you can't manage this in the moment as it's happening. So that's not to say you failed and you should be ashamed. It's just to understand what's at stake, to help offer a point of focus, to give you a why. Why fight to stay present? Why fight to heal? Because you lose so much, and others lose quite a bit too, whether they know it or not. Your loved ones probably wouldn't take another person's side if they could fully understand this. But what they see from you validates what the perpetrator is claiming against you, and it makes it hard for them to feel sound in standing by you at those times. So you lose their support, but they also lose their trust and their relationship with you in so many ways. And when there are children involved, it's extra tragic. So this is why. Some states nullify the responsibility to pay spousal support if the abuser can frame the victim as the abusive one. So you can lose resources that you rely on to survive because of this. Abusers use this loophole to mischaracterize and frame the victim. Having turned the community against them, their friends and family might end up testifying on the abuser's behalf. So this is the quagmire into which this leads us if we don't know what's happening and we can't get traction on it. And I hate for anybody to be so disempowered by such an awful set of circumstances. We're more. We deserve more. And I think we can do more to change our conditions and help others to understand what it is that so many people are working through. All right. The effect on the victim. I need a drink of water for this. Of course, the same things that are advantageous to the abuser are the most damaging to the victim. Internal confusion and self-doubt can make the victim feel they need to remain in the relationship because they either mistakenly believe they are equally responsible or don't believe they'll get the support they need if they leave. And again, that might be a fact. All the while, the abuser is never held accountable, and they're not going to volunteer to take accountability. So don't hold your breath unless blue is your color. Also, most victims are very confused to see themselves reacting abusively with their partners. The hitting, raging, or other toxic reactions are uncharacteristic of how the victim would normally react when dealing with the conflict. And this is part of what causes the trauma. We have a self-concept and we try to live within it. And the more we're aligned with that, the more harmonious things feel. And the more we come out of alignment with that, the more dissonant things feel. We have egosyntonic and ego-dystonic states. And when we are egosyntonic, we feel that we are aligned. And when we are dystonic, we feel that we're at odds with that there's a split in our understanding. So that could be really damaging on its own. Witnessing their own aggressive response, which comes without forethought, is surprising and concerning to them. I think often people are most shocked by their own reactions than anybody else. It's probably most startling to the person having this reaction because it'll come like a wave breaking over them from behind, and it's all of the emotion and all of the outpouring that they didn't, what did they say? They didn't approach it with forethought. So yeah, they try to stop reacting aggressively but fail. It is difficult, if not impossible, for victims to heal from their trauma symptoms while in an atmosphere of ongoing trauma. This is how we get stuck in the loop, because you're traumatized, now you're having a trauma response, now somebody's provoking you to react from a place of being caught in a trauma response, and what comes out is not consistent with who you are, which is alarming and disquieting in so many ways because it doesn't align with our sense of self, which makes us feel crazy, makes us feel guilty, makes us doubt ourselves, makes it harder for us to be clear and express what's going on and seek support from people who now see us this way, right? This is the mess. They are trapped in a cycle of abuse with impaired cognitive function, which makes healthy decision-making more difficult. Victims instinctively know that leaving the abuser will bring on escalated abuse and retaliation in ways the victim cannot know for sure. The anticipatory fear of the trauma to come leaves them paralyzed rather than empowered to leave. The abuser compounds their guilt by calling the victim abusive or unstable. Or they feign concern for their emotional well-being, making the victim believe they are not well. You're not well. There's something wrong with you. If we could just get you help, everything would be fine, right? They don't want to get you help. That would flip their script. This would be a totally different situation if they were genuinely invested in your well-being and were doing what was necessary to get you support and help you heal. You wouldn't keep having these experiences. So that's another ploy. They might even offer to pay for the victim to seek professional help so they can prove, I was just so concerned about my person having this problem. I don't know what's going on. I'm beside myself, right? All right. This increases the victim's sense of self-doubt, makes them question their own sanity, and increases their sense of dependence on their partner, while also establishing a therapeutic record of their tendency to react aggressively. And that's another factor when I talk about the legal dimensions. If a person who's being targeted by this is having these reactions and seeks help, that having sought that help can be used against them as evidence of them being problematic. Right? Yeah. So we got to be careful when we reach out for support to understand who we're working with. And what I would recommend here is to get involved in well-regulated online communities. Some communities, it's the Wild West. It's inmates running asylums. I'm not talking about that, but there are some online groups that are really much better managed, and the tone and the culture are actually quite healthy and quite supportive. So there's a lot to be gained there. Um, it's also possible to work with coaches around specific issues. So if you say, I have trouble with my boundaries, or have trouble asserting myself, or I'm trying to learn better emotional regulation without telling the story, without making any record of it, there are ways to get support. Certainly, friends, if you're religious, you may have support within whatever religious community is available to you. So there are other ways. Don't not get help because therapy is maybe a liability in this case. Okay. Um, what victims often don't realize is they likely have post-traumatic stress disorder or complex PTSD, which presents in myriad ways from anger, frustration, fear, paranoia, and other emotions, and explains their uncharacteristic response to their partner. Complex PTSD is difficult to heal. CPTSD alters their mind and body in overwhelming ways, talking about the effect on the hippocampal mass, right? The volume, I guess it's called. Um, yeah, and there's something about the junction between, I think, the adrenals, pituitary, and is it thyroid, thalamus? I forget. Anyway, there's a link in our nervous system that gets hyperstimulated and gets caught in a feedback loop. So there are different physiological things happening at a root neurological level that really do mean in some ways we are not entirely mentally well, but that is being identified as a different kind of pathology from what it actually is. So it's very confusing to be like, yeah, I'm kind of crazy in this way, but not in the way you think. People aren't hearing that when you're distraught and incoherent. They're not hearing it. So it's extra difficult to get people to help identify the problem and treat it in this way. And CPTSD is something that I hope will become ever more mainstream, and people will have better understanding and support around it because it is truly complex. It's not just because it is several compounded experiences that cause the PTSD. It's because it is complex to unravel it as well. So this is another piece, and a lot of what I'm talking about in these videos is for people who have probably dealt with some amount of trauma, whether typically it's going to be the trauma we all experience. Just becoming a person is traumatic. There's going to be that. People may experience singular traumas that you could say, this thing happened on this date, it went down like this. But CPTSD is a little more tricky because it can be everything from something that we experienced when we were infants in a pre-verbal state. We couldn't, pardon me, couldn't identify that maybe we were hungry and we were calling out to be fed and somebody didn't come. That can actually induce some amount of trauma at one level. That's sort of the becoming a person is traumatic side of it. But as neglect and injury mounts over time, that's when you start to see more significant developmental trauma. And even if you didn't have much, that didn't have much impact on you prior to adulthood, there are situations in which you can be in a long-term abusive relationship and develop CPTSD as a response to that. So yeah, this is important to understand, that there are issues around personality disorders and PTSD to take into account when we see this pattern. All right. Often with covert emotional abuse, the victim does not realize that they are being abused, which results in confusion and high levels of stress about their circumstances. High stress and confusion over an extended period of time will likely cause PTSD, making it nearly impossible to recognize a connection between their trauma symptoms, hidden forms of manipulation and abuse, and their reactive behaviors. Sometimes that's not evident. You don't necessarily get a clean trail of breadcrumbs to that realization. So there's a shortcut. The longer high stress and confusion continue, the more stress hormones and the more mentally and physically compromised the victim becomes. So it starts with saying, "You sure you're not crazy?" and ending with, "You kind of are," because it's had this huge impact on your system at so many levels. Fragmented thinking and communication increase. They involuntarily shake and are emotionally and physically exhausted. Their endocrine and immune systems often become compromised or collapsed, resulting in numerous physical illnesses. Sometimes we can't even get out of bed to fight the fight because we're so broken down. Each symptom primes the victim to become more compromised and reactive in ways that are not normal for them. The victim has limited access to executive functions in the brain. Initially, they cannot control how they react, and it's nearly impossible to understand why they react out of character. Many feel significant shame and guilt long after they have left the abusive relationship. This is one of the legacies, and while being able to contain a little bit of healthy guilt and shame, to say it was not okay the way I behaved, I owe apologies to innocent bystanders, right? That's good, but we also do have to forgive ourselves, to give ourselves grace for doing what we could with what we had under really difficult conditions, and to move past that guilt, and especially the shame of saying, "I'm a bad person, I don't deserve what other people deserve." That's toxic too. We don't want to carry toxic elements from the time of being in a toxic relationship into a time of healing while we're making every effort to flourish. So we have to shed that. And that's part of our work. It's not your fault. That guy hit you with his car, but it's your work to go to physical therapy and recover. So that's where that comes out. Confusion for responders. You know what? Let's get into this because this is what I was talking about with legal concerns. A common issue with reactive abuse is that responders mistakenly believe both people in the relationship are abusive or that the victim is the real abuser. This happens because reactive abuse often includes the same types of destructive behaviors the primary abuser uses, and some of this is by design, that there is a weird transference. There's like a projection of what the abuser brings onto and into the target, who will then internalize that and act it out unconsciously. And it's really kind of creepy. So, yeah. And responders do not know how to recognize the signs of abuse and trauma in the victim, which tells a more accurate story. This is what I hope we can change. People talk about raising awareness. Where are we lifting it up to? What's it for? This is very specifically that I would like to see people like first responders, people working in shelters, in the legal system, these types of people with the better understanding would be better equipped to meet the real needs of people who are trapped in these situations. So this is one of the reasons I'm looking to further this discussion. They also fail to understand an abuser's destructive belief systems and patterns of behavior, or why victims react aggressively. Yeah, that's another thing. It's very hard to understand that the perpetrator doesn't necessarily hold the same views and values as most of the other people around them. They might really value destruction. Sometimes destruction is the reason, it's the cause, it's the whole purpose of the thing. It's to create chaos and suffering. It gives a thrill, it empowers them, sometimes turns them on. So yeah, it's kind of like somebody with an addiction seeking a fix, and it doesn't make sense when you see that. But in this case, destructive belief systems actually behave sort of like an addiction. It's sort of being like, I deserve more. These people are to blame. They should pay for what they don't give me, this kind of stuff. And they don't care. They'll follow a scorched earth policy. They will destroy everything in sight to level the playing field according to their perception. So outsiders have a hard time believing somebody would come with that point of view or that approach. And it's hard to convince them that, yeah, no, there's genuine malice here. So that's part of it too. As soon as they see the violent nature of the victim's response, it's proof that the victim is the person to blame, or that they are both abusers. Many therapists and law enforcement personnel believe both parties are abusive. Experts, however, who specialize in trauma and abuse know otherwise. Simply put, there are rarely two abusers in an abusive intimate relationship. The National Domestic Violence Hotline reports on its website there is no such thing as mutual abuse. So this isn't just a fringe concept. This is held by well-informed specialists and services such as the National Domestic Violence Hotline. So there is a pattern of power and control that makes mutual abuse virtually impossible in the actual situations of domestic violence, and also does not exist when so-called abuse is reactive. Many people engage in situational violence, which is not intimate partner violence, but situational violence lacks the power imbalance existing in relationship abuse. This is important. I kind of forgot about this, but the power differential is it's like a diagnostic criteria, because it really shows if one person has the ability to take away a person's resources or freedom or reputation, and the other person is not willing or able to do that, it's not a fair fight. It's not mutual abuse. Two people on the same level choose to enter in that ring and do battle. That's different. This is one person is in a vulnerable position and the other person uses power to exploit that. So that's a really key point here. Not called abuse. Okay. There is nothing mutual about a victim's defensive reactions to their abuser's controlling, antagonistic, manipulative, or aggressive behaviors. When hidden forms of emotional abuse are present, outsiders are even less likely to see what is occurring or understand the impact the relationship has on the victim. The way the traumatized victim presents makes it more likely for others to believe the victim is the one who is out of sorts, lacking credibility, and guilty of the conflict in the relationship. Hidden forms of abuse and manipulation are so confusing and difficult to identify and describe that victims cannot find the words to explain best what they are enduring or to advocate for themselves. Responders make the mistake of blaming the victim instead of helping them. Instead, responders need to educate themselves about the dynamics of abuse and become more aware of the relationship between hidden forms of emotional abuse and trauma. For everything first responders have to know and learn and stay up to date with, yes, there's one more point that I think would empower them to more effectively serve the people who are really in need. So this I agree with. Emotional abuse is the common thread in all relational abuse cases. Therefore, it is essential that people, helpers, and responders become educated to recognize these subtle, aggressive or passive-aggressive behaviors. If they don't, they risk causing further harm and trauma to the victim through their inadvertent or intentionally destructive responses. Yeah, so. All right, this is a piece I gave myself an assignment to try and discern the difference between conflict and reactive abuse. So conflict and manipulation, right? This is a question of how can you know when violence is reactive or abusive? So let's see what these guys have to say. So how can you tell who is the abuser and who is the victim in the couple before you? How can you know the difference when both are acting in an emotionally or physically violent manner? To answer these questions, it's essential to understand some of the signs of trauma. Trauma and the abuser. Trauma from abuse causes physical symptoms such as uncontrollable shaking or trembling, difficulty communicating effectively, fragmented thinking or communication, willingness to self-blame, emotional fragility, and autoimmune diseases and other unexplained physical illnesses. Trauma victims often experience emotional dysregulation, vacillating between emotional outbursts, crying, anger, frustration, confusion, or complete disconnection from any emotion. That last part, when we go into learned helplessness and self-abandon, that's the bleak end of that list. In contrast, the abuser shows a high level of skill when controlling their emotions, words, and physical stature, making them appear cool and calm compared to the victim's frantic, insecure, or confused state. Getting the picture now? Victims are also much more agreeable to accepting responsibility for their mistakes. They are naturally empathic and eager to self-reflect. In contrast, the abuser has little to no inner critic or ability to self-reflect when directing his criticism toward his partner. The abuser will say and do just about anything to avoid accountability and responsibility for their actions. The victim will be highly traumatized by the abuser's false narrative and false accusations, and the presence of law enforcement, and the victim will likely be incapable of articulating an accurate explanation to counter them. And let's remember, for people who are not seeking conflict or control or acting from destructive belief systems, interactions with law enforcement can be traumatizing in their own right. It can be humiliating and upsetting. It can have lasting consequences, and it's no small matter. So if you see somebody being really calm in a moment like that, it's time to raise a brow and ask a question. Like, how are you so calm? Why is this normal to you to have this level of conflict and now police involvement with possible legal repercussions? That's a clue. All right. Get into best practices here. What else we got? A note for victims: what to do if you're the victim lashing out. All right, let's see what they have to say. Many victims who react abusively to their abuser's actions wonder if they are the actual abuser and experience considerable guilt about how they've behaved. How can you be sure you're not an abuser? The fact that you're questioning yourself and are willing to consider the possibility strongly indicates that you are not, right? This is true of personality disorders too. People say, how do I know I'm not the narcissist? You're asking the question, simply. Abusers don't self-reflect. They rarely accept full responsibility for their abusive actions. They blame the other person in subtle or overt ways. When you are confused by your reactive outbursts, note it. If those behaviors are uncharacteristic, do not assume you are mentally ill or abusive. The fact that those responses are uncharacteristic is essential. Now, I want to zoom out a little on this one, because the way we get into relationships with people who would do this, it's not that everything was fine until they started doing this. There were other problems, there were other signs. It's possibly because we were raised in an abusive environment. At least we had a high number of, adverse childhood experiences that left us with a certain amount of developmental trauma and a broken concept of what relationships are and what's acceptable within them. So I think that this requires a little more refinement. Because of early developmental trauma, we may have more high conflict experiences. We might be more prone to that. We might have developed a fight response to be able to survive the particular conditions we faced. And in that, it may not be that this is the only time we've acted this way. So I think the better question is, in most conditions, with most people, assuming that people are acting on good faith and abiding by the general terms of the social contract, they're not being hostile, abusive, manipulative, exploitative, do you generally default to a calm, pro-social, functional state that works well with others? Or do you come into stable environments and create instability as a matter of habit, right? So it's not that you've never acted this way before, but in the times that you have acted from a place of disproportionate anger or whatever other response might come up, were there other conditions similar to this when you slipped into that state? Or do you go into sound situations where people are doing fine and playing nice and you bring the problems? Because that's going to be another way to parse this. It's not necessarily that, yeah, I've had this before. You may have it many times in many contexts, but we're trying to look at what those situations have in common versus the situations wherein most of the time with most of the people, it's not a problem. So that's a finer point on that one. Where did we leave off? The term reactive abuse means just that. You are the one reacting to abuse, not the one initiating abuse or to blame for it. Your abuser's faulty thinking, distorted beliefs about interpersonal relationships, sense of entitlement, domineering attitudes, and focus on managing their public image at the expense of the victim are the pillars that describe an abusive mindset. Yeah, that's a pretty good start. To be sure about what role you have assumed, seek help from a licensed professional experienced in emotional abuse and trauma. Again, consider the liability around that, but do seek support. They're also saying to make use of the National Domestic Violence Hotline or local domestic violence shelter. Again, you got to consider what you're initiating when you do that, because once that's started, you kind of do end up on a track. So be prepared for things to change and for new demands to present if you do take that path, because it's important to seek refuge and support, but also to be in a place that you're able to take action to utilize that without fully upending the apple cart of your life. So finer points all the way through. Here, they're saying another impactful resource is taking the MEND Project's self-paced course, Finding Clarity. So here's another resource. You can go in and use online resources like this from these folks who are hosting this article right now. If you are in an abusive relationship, you have likely been emotionally beaten down and disparaged for a long time, months, years, or even decades. Once you have gained clarity regarding the types of abusive patterns you've endured, the way you view yourself internally, and your lack of self-love and overwhelming feelings of self-doubt, it is an excellent next phase to work on with a therapist trained in abuse. So, yeah, in the past, your focus has likely been on helping your abuser change. Nothing you do will change your abuser. You may be ready to set a firm boundary, to separate from your abuser, which in a few cases may be a motivating factor for the abuser to desire from a wellspring inside themselves to do the lengthy hard work required to change. Okay, so occasionally a person will change, but we're not betting everything on that. That's not the usual outcome. We can only change our behavior and what we believe about ourselves, which will in turn help us become more decisive about saying no to abuse. So this is an overview through a few different articles. I know I have more in here as well. I'm not going to go through everything, but I wanted to cover some of the key points and get into a little more discussion around them. I've also got something that I worked up myself in trying to make sense of how we discern what is regular conflict. Like, am I being an asshole here? Is this right? Or is this reactive abuse? So what I write here, is it reactive abuse? How to distinguish conflict from manipulation. And on the left, I wrote conflict, and on the right, I wrote reactive abuse, typed actually. Here are some examples of how to discern one from the other. In healthy conflict, normal conflict, the other person seems confused and possibly upset by what's happening. In reactive abuse, the other person seems calm and possibly satisfied with what's happening. On the conflict side, the other person is focused on the issue at hand and is seeking resolution. On the reactive abuse column, other person seems unable to focus on the issue at hand and does not seem interested in achieving resolution. Other person is looking to de-escalate the conflict, or other person acts to perpetuate and actively escalate the conflict. Other person seeks privacy if others are present, or other person retains or seeks out an audience for the conflict. Other person demonstrates self-awareness, accountability, and can acknowledge the limits of their righteousness. Other person demonstrates a narrow perspective, a lack of accountability, and struggles to acknowledge their own fallibility. In conflict, other person is attempting to understand and align the perspectives and narratives of all involved parties, whereas in reactive abuse, the other person is attempting to distort and control the perspectives and shared narratives of those involved or present. After conflict, the other person will consider the matter resolved and leave it in the past if it's natural, normal conflict that arises. Or, after the conflict, the other person will use your reactions as evidence that you were to blame for the problem at cause and the conflict that ensued. I need to rewrite that. Anyway, in normal conflict, a person wants to get to where there's forgiveness and resolution. In manipulation, it's going to be used against you as leverage to keep you quiet, to keep you humble, to keep you weak. So that's what I'm trying to say there. Conflict. Other person will not use your exceptional responses to derogate your character, mental fitness, or worth as a person. In manipulation, the other person will use your responses as evidence that you are of bad character, poor mental health, weak intellect, or lesser value in general. In conflict, another person will not use the conflict to manipulate, coerce, or control you or the situation to their advantage, where in manipulation, another person will use the conflict to gain leverage or power over you or the situation to advance their personal aims. In conflict, other person will likely feel alienated and need time to be physically or emotionally close again after the conflict is over. Here's a weird one. In reactive abuse, in this kind of manipulation, the other person may seek physical or emotional proximity or intimacy almost immediately after the conflict subsides. Yeah, there's something about that there's you're supposed to just keep going forward as if everything's fine and kissy make up now. No resolution, no real accountability, no real forgiveness, but we'll just kiss and make up and keep going. Yeah, it's a little off-putting. In conflict, another person can forgive and forget, but in manipulation, the other person keeps the incident in their arsenal for future use. That's a little bit repetitive to what I said above, but it's specifically that you're stocking another person's arsenal when you give them these reactions. So that gets its own. In conflict, you feel that you are being heard and responded to from a place of good faith. In manipulation, you feel that you are not being heard and that what you say and do are being distorted. In conflict, you are able to stay present, regulate your emotions, and de-escalate the intensity with which you approach the conflict. In manipulation, you feel hijacked, disoriented, and struggle to self-regulate or mitigate the intensity of your feelings and responses. Yeah, we have a few more. This is a first draft. This is me just sort of feeling through what I have ricocheting around in my big bank of knowledge and trying to articulate it, but this does cover a lot of it. In conflict, the conflict has emerged from otherwise stable conditions around a particular issue that is an exceptional point of contention in the relationship, whereas with manipulation, the conflict emerges from a continuing pattern of instability and hostility and can be entangled in any number of other issues in a typically contentious relationship. In conflict, you are genuinely interested in resolving the issues and repairing the rupture in your relationship. In manipulation, the other person seems intent on winning the fight, being right, or getting their way, regardless of the cost to the relationship. So, is the relationship being valued and served, or is it being thrown under the bus for the interests of one party? All right. In conflict, you are focused on the facts and evidence, the needs of all concerned, and the best resolution possible. In manipulation, the other person is focused on their subjective experience, their own wants or needs, and fighting until they feel vindicated or achieve their aim. In conflict, the conflict is exceptional, whereas in manipulation, conflict is part of an enduring relational pattern. In conflict, it is specific to circumstance. Something happens and a conflict arises in response to an isolated incident, versus when manipulation is in play, conflict arises regardless of circumstances. So no matter what changes, conflict continues to arise in the same ways. So a person says, please don't leave your shoes there. So you move them to the shoe rack. They say, must you put your shoes on the shoe rack when they still have mud in the treads? So you brush out the mud from the treads before putting them on the shoe. Must you put them on the top shelf? That's where I put my shoes. This is not about you're getting it wrong. This is about you're supposed to be getting it wrong so they can be angry, so you can have the fight. So, right? All right. In conflict gives rise to better mutual understanding, accord, and even a deepening of intimacy and trust. When we can have difficulties, resolve them together, and come back together feeling resolved and connected and understood, that actually deepens our intimacy and enhances our ability to trust in one another, because we've weathered the storm and we've traversed the challenges with some degree of shared mastery and good intent, right? So this can actually be weirdly a team building thing. Conflict has a bad reputation, but it does serve. However, if we're talking about reactive abuse or manipulation in general, conflict ends up giving rise to deeper confusion, discord, and a loss of intimacy and trust. It's not neutral. It's a loss, because it's going to damage your ability to trust yourself, to trust the other, and to feel any way safe or secure within the relationship. So, very damaging. Right. In conflict, you feel satisfied by the outcomes. You're like, wow, that was tough. I'm sorry we had a tough time with each other and it wasn't fun, but I'm glad we understand each other and now we have a better way forward that we're both feeling good about. In manipulation, another clue is that you and the other person both feel resentment concerning the outcomes. You're like, fine, we'll do it your way. It's not my way. It's always your way. No, this shit. You're like, nobody's happy, but you just keep lurching forward because you can't gnaw your leg off and escape as you might like to. All right. Last two. In conflict, truth is objective. People are trying to say, well, you saw what I saw, right? We understand that, like, it was at this time of day that these things happened, or we're looking for reference points in a shared experience, in a shared reality, and trying to say, okay, we see that this is how it happened. I understand how you might have understood this. What I really meant was this. Can we try to square that circle and make sense of the fact that while it did appear this way and I see why you were upset, I want you to see in my heart I was coming from this place and I just executed poorly without being aware of that particular factor. So you're working with what is to get to a place of mutual understanding, and objective truth is rather important. If you're dealing with somebody who's prepared to manipulate you to this extent, their truth is subjective. It's, I trust my senses. I know what I saw. I heard you tell me this. This is how it is. Because I feel this way. I know it's right. These things. It's completely unrelated to what's going on in the world in terms of facts. And you can even offer absolute stacks of evidence, being like, okay, this thing happened, that thing happened. This didn't come out the way it was supposed to. You assured me that this was going to happen. I was relying on it. It didn't come through. Thinking, oh, yeah, and agree with every bit of that. And then you say, so you understand why I'm upset? And they're like, no, you're just crazy. You're just making mountains out of molehills again. Right? So it's the subjective experience of truth at play. And finally, when you're in conflict with somebody and you're both acting in good faith and you value the relationship and you want resolution, peace is the shared goal. And if you're working with somebody who is using reactive abuse to get control over you and or otherwise manipulating, peace was never an option. That's how you know. It wasn't about putting the shoes on the rack right. It was about, we're going to have conflict because it serves me at your expense. And I'm okay with that. I feel no remorse, but you do. So I can exploit that to keep you weak and servile. So these are the things we're going to be looking at as we go through. Beyond just questioning, it's enough just to be like, oh, am I the... Probably not if you're asking the question. But if you want a different razor to work with, to be able to fine slice it one from the other, these are some of your clues right here. And I'm sure there is an abundance of more useful information I could add to this, but I've been going on for over an hour and it's a lot to take on. And I know I said I don't do infotainment, and it's not really about, did you know the 5 signs that I don't like working at that level, but I do like to get into the information and bring it in a way that we can kind of explore it a little more deeply and contextualize it and plug ideas into each other and see how it relates and how it all fits together. Because knowing what reactive abuse is a great start. That was a huge breakthrough for me in my understanding and my approach to a situation I found myself in. However, it's not nearly sufficient to navigate an effective path forward in the process of extricating yourself from the damaging relationship and healing yourself to be able to live the rich, full life you deserve on the other side. So this is why I wanted to get into it at greater depth and say that if you're experiencing this, look deeper into this and consider some of these resources, some of these ways of discerning what is and isn't really going on in your situation, to consider the ways in which you can make a plan to get forward and heal and live a better life, because nobody deserves this. However badly you may act under these conditions, you don't deserve what's happening, and the people around you don't deserve the chaos and the destruction that this brings. So it's my hope that through better understanding and more thorough consideration, we can actually figure out how all of these pieces fit together, because I know there's been a huge surge in people's interest around narcissistic personality disorder. By extension, more and more people are talking about trauma from abusive relationships and trying to resolve CPTSD. And I think this is a piece of the puzzle that hasn't clicked in with the others yet. And when we start putting the pieces together, we get a more complete image of what we're working with. And through that clarity and understanding, we do take back a little bit of the power and give ourselves a view of how to proceed. And I think being trapped and feeling so disoriented, almost blinded by everything swirling around and coming in relentlessly, that just getting that clarity is one of the first most important toeholds. So I hope you're beyond needing that toehold and you're well into recovery. But if not, this is my more comprehensive view of what this is and how it impacts us and what we can do about it. So I hope that is of some value and is in some way helpful, and that we are all moving in better directions toward wholer, richer, more fulfilling lives with greater dignity and peace, that we can extend that to others and build networks of healthy people, healthy communities around us. And that's the quality of life we experience, is what we have in those domains. So if you're in hell, keep moving, keep going, because there are better places out beyond this. There are better ways of living, and I hope that this is some small contribution to that effort. All right, well, thank you for coming along on this extended journey around all these ideas. I always appreciate your presence and engagement. I would love to hear from you in comments. If you're enjoying this, give it a like. You want more, subscribe. I always forget to promote this because this is more of a personal project than a YouTube channel, but can reach more people and refine the work as more people come in, and I can see where we all want to bring the conversation, and we do have greater need of more comprehensive and nuanced understanding. So do please get engaged, and if you don't choose to do that, come around for the next round. I'll look forward to seeing you there. Okay, thanks so much. Take care.